Hello and welcome to Sustainapod, the youth-led podcast for young people and anyone passionate about sustainability around the world. Welcome back to our Green Careers series, where we delve into the journeys of a range of professionals working in the field of sustainability. Today's guest is Tiffany Yu. Tiffany is currently a technical business analyst at Treeconomy, a UK startup that uses remote sensing data to quantify and monitor the impact of nature-based solutions. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me.
So, shall we start with a bit of an intro? Can you tell me more about how you ended up in your current role and the journey that you took?
Yeah, so I am originally from Hong Kong and I studied in college in the US. I was largely interested in technology. I have a double degree in computer science and engineering. And then I came to the UK for work as a software engineer. I worked at Visa for 2.5 years and then worked for an energy company called OVO for a year also, and then decided to pursue a master's with Belinda actually in an MSc in Imperial called environmental technology. I got to Treeconomy largely because is a startup that started by Imperial alumni. So the COO that I work with, it's called Rob. He is an alumni of the same course, I think 2 or 3 years ago. So they've been chatting, they've been around the whole entire cohort. I thought I thought they were cool. So I just emailed them and they said yes. So here I am doing the job.
Great, and definitely want to find out more about what Tree Economy is doing. But before that, we did meet on the Masters. So I want to ask you, how do you think the Masters played a role in terms of that bridge between your previous experience, being at an energy company now to ending up in Tree Economy? Like, how did you find the Masters overall?
Yeah, I thought it was actually quite crucial, largely, well, with all education things. I don't know if this is controversial or not. It's not really the knowledge or the specific things that you remember that is really important. It's literally about like learning how to talk to other people and work in groups. It's a lot of soft skills. And it's also confidence. Like through the experience, I built confidence to be able to speak about sustainability for a longest amount of time as a software engineer. I was passionate about it, but I just felt like, oh, this is a hobby. Like this is just a side thing. Like I didn't feel qualified in a certain sense to speak my mind and my opinions and feel like I had ground. And by doing this MSc through experience, not just the name, definitely not because of the name, but through conversations with people, through exposure with industry people, I felt confident enough to be like, oh, my opinion matters. And yeah, it helped in that sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I really like what you're talking about essentially is you have that technical background with computer science and like coding, for example, but also bridging that with more technical knowledge of sustainability. So can you tell us a little bit more about what Tree Economy is doing? Like how is it using remote sensing data? And also for our listeners, what exactly are nature-based solutions?
Yeah, of course. So nature-based solutions is kind of a catch-all phrase for utilizing and optimizing nature as like a system to solve multiple problems that our environment has. So for example, carbon sequestration. Forests is the easiest one. It's like carbon sequestration with forests, air quality improvement. If you plant fruit trees, you have kind of a livelihood. So it's a solution which is multifaceted, but also in a way has a life of its own because as humans, we don't actually know exactly how ecosystems fully work at this moment, which is surprising in many senses, but also like once you delve into it, it's really complex. There are connections between species, between microorganisms that we just haven't discovered yet. So the benefits of a full healthy ecosystem is unclear. So how Treeconomy kind of wants to tackle this, obviously we're not like top researchers, but we're trying to bridge the gap between commercial and research. So research has done a lot of work trying to apply biodiversity, carbon sequestration, using remote sensing to more accurately calculate how much carbon is sequestered by trees. But commercially, this service isn't really available right now, especially in the voluntary carbon market, which we will delve into a little bit more later, hopefully. There is no standard. It's just kind of like the Wild West for anything. So Treeconomy is trying to, within their influence, add to like a more quantitative approach to calculating carbon sequestration from forests specifically at the moment. But there are projects that are around where it's really interesting. So mangroves is a very interesting project that we are interested in. Peatlands are also really interesting. But we are working with researchers and commercial people to develop these frameworks and ways of quantifying carbon and benefits, using remote sensing data. Remote sensing data could be classified into two large categories: satellite data and drone data. So drone data, someone has to fly the drone, take pictures. They use laser essentially to figure out the canopy height, like just scan like the whole entire ground and also take photos. And we use that data to count specific trees and then convert that into biomass and give them a more holistic number than having someone measure a tree in the real life, and that takes a lot of time.
You're really touching on just how technology is revolutionizing the way we understand nature. And in the past decade, like market-based approaches have really taken off as a solution to preserve, protect, and also generate more funding for
Mhm.
natural resources. So it's a very, very exciting space to be in and really bridging, the business side with the science behind carbon
Yes.
sequestration, for example, which you are right, we will touch on. But as this is the Green Careers series, and you are working as a startup, I'm sure our listeners are very keen to know more about what it's like to be in a startup. What do you think would be one word that you would use to describe your experience at Treeconomy?
This is so cliche, but dynamic is definitely true. I think everyone working at a startup would tell you that, like, you join a startup thinking you're doing a specific job, and then you actually end up doing like 15 others. And I mean, I like it. I think it's really exciting. I think it's really fun, but it might not be for everyone.
Nice. Since you had that experience before in like an energy company, for example, how would you compare your experiences in a more established, larger company compared to a startup?
Yeah, I think there are pros and cons to both. I think working at a bigger company, there's a lot of boundaries and red tape when you're trying to get something new going on. But once you do and people are actually on it, it might accelerate really fast because resources are less of a problem. In a big company, it is about influencing other people. It's about influencing managers, influencing people who are making decisions. Depending on the company, you may or may not have access to these people. It might become frustrating in that point. And startup, obviously not an issue. Like if you think of something, you tell your coworkers, they say go for it. You tell your CEO, they say go for it, try it out. But on the other hand, the resources thing is a big thing because your influence is lower, your monetary time and human resources are lower. So it's a bigger risk to put your time and attention on something that is hypothetical as compared to something that is more established and you could do that because there's always something that you could be doing in a startup. So I think that is the biggest difference, especially within sustainability. You have to talk about business, you have to talk about technology, you have to talk about like ecosystems, and like it's not a very siloed work stream. And I think this type of flexibility and this kind of dynamic really helps like finding solutions that like a more traditional chocker block, this is your role, this is your lane, don't stick out of it situation. Like, I think that just startup culture is much more adaptive to that.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about your specific role within Treeconomy?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I started off part-time during my dissertation as a software engineer, just purely as a software engineer. I largely worked in back-end infrastructure, so creating essentially slight automation of data processing. So when like the remote sensing data come in, we need to write a report. All the steps in between were really manual. I was tasked to essentially streamline that to make it less manual and faster so that we can create more reports. So that was the start. And then after my MSc dissertation finished, I talked to my co-founders. I was like, I'm quite interested in like the business aspect of understanding the market, of more commercial type things. Could I have a role that's kind of a dual purpose of that so I can think about and talk about commercial things, but I can still continue doing my engineering job? And they said yes. And the technical business analyst name was literally just something that I picked out of the internet because the job role and description like matched what I wanted to do. So I just offered it to them and they said yes. I'm very grateful, obviously. It allows me to stretch my boundaries of what I think I can do and what I actually can do quite a lot because of the trust that they've given me. So I'm a person that wears a lot of hats, I guess, in the company. I do almost everything under the sun for the company that needs to be done, both in an engineering way and in a commercial way whenever.
That makes sense. So, what do you think are useful skill sets to build up for someone that's looking to enter this space, which is essentially kind of climate tech, I'd say, but really working at the intersection of so many different disciplines?
Yeah, I think the most important skill set is to just like be okay with not knowing everything, but still go for it. Is this a skill set? I don't know, but it is.
It's a
It,
mindset. It's a
it's a
mind.
exactly because everyone brings something to the table, and you don't need to be the person that brings everything to the table. I like being comfortable with asking the people who do know more for more information. Like sustainability is this intersection of so many disciplines. You cannot be the professional of all disciplines. So I think that like having that mindset and like being comfortable with being uncomfortable, being the person who doesn't know the most in the room is so important, but also understanding that your experience and where you came from like adds value to it. So I did not realize my technological background would fit. I thought it was just kind of like, oh, I would create this product that someone will use. But actually speaking to data scientists and things, like it was definitely like a conversation that made, this product better between like GIS data scientists and me. And I didn't realize like a technological background would add to the conversation in a certain way. So that was a surprise. And I think that mindset is really important, because if you can't listen but also you can't contribute, the conversation won't happen, and then this cross-section solutionizing won't happen also. So yeah, hopefully
That's a
that.
really, really good point. Essentially, what you're saying is that everyone has their own added value. Even if something as technical as carbon sequestration and using data also needs, for example, like a business person with that skill set of really bringing it to market, for example. And I think this is going to evolve as the climate tech landscape evolves as well. So speaking of that, how do you see the trajectory of climate tech innovation in the coming years? In the UK, there's definitely a huge proliferation of different startups working on these different solutions. So, yeah, would love to
Yeah,
know your thoughts on that.
it's quite interesting. I obviously am not a market professional, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt. But I think there has been a bubble of startups focusing on like B2C clients. So a lot about people's habits, like eating or like recycling and stuff like that. And that is still like being maintained, but it's not growing as fast as before. I believe there's a lot of B2B companies. So like selling to bigger businesses that are coming up. London specifically is very interested in the idea of like financing and ensuring a lot of different types of projects, including nature-based solutions. Energy is always something that is on the radar, especially with the current war. That demand has also definitely spiked, but it's a harder industry to join as a startup as compared to other parts of sustainability. Yeah, that's kind of how I'm seeing it at the moment. One of the biggest gaps that I see in startups in the UK or London is kind of around food systems. So startup culture hasn't really clocked on to like food systems, I think, and that's, I think, a very big gap in development for startups in general, because it will become more and more of an issue in the future. But yeah, that's kind of some trends that I see from my little exposure bubble.
Really
Yeah.
interesting. I agree with you fully about the food systems work, which is what I'm really passionate about. And I think it also goes to show that there are so many different sectors that you can go into, even in a startup and working in the tech space. And it
Mhm.
shows the way like tech is really a tool that can be used for various purposes in this field. So, loads of new opportunities coming up. And so, I'd like to shift the focus now to talk more about carbon offsetting, carbon sequestration. For our listeners, some of this might be new. So, can you start by explaining more about what carbon offsets are and why they are important when it comes to the discussions the world is having now for sustainability?
Yeah, definitely. Carbon offsets are simple but complicated in many ways. So carbon credits in general just represents a ton of carbon equivalent. So like methane could essentially be transferred into carbon, but everyone just talks about carbon. So a credit, it just represents 1 ton of carbon. So that is the simple part of it. How it's being used is the ultimate like complex thing. So there are many, many markets at which carbon credits can be used. One is the compliance one, which is kind of national wide. The government sets an industry cap essentially, and then those are represented by credits. And then they can only emit to that cap or pay a fine, and the government can lower this cap gradually over time to incentivize the industry to lower their emissions, essentially. So that's one way of using it. Another way of using it is through national NDCs. So in the Paris Agreement, every country had to declare NDC. And then there is an article, Article 6, that allows countries to cooperate with other countries to lower their like emissions. That is expressed in carbon credits. So it's not offsetting per se as like a more traditional context, but for example, like countries in the EU could fund projects in Ghana, which is one of the few countries that also are very involved in this type of trade, to reduce their national determined contribution to emissions. So that is a very volatile space at the moment. It's very controversial. There's a lot to talk about in that space. But the space that Treeconomy operates at is the voluntary carbon market, which is also very volatile and very like controversial. This is much more of a global market where companies just can purchase offsets or carbon credits to offset their own emissions, essentially. Or like you and I could purchase a carbon credit to offset our flights, for example. So yeah, those are 3 ways a carbon credit could be used currently in the market, which is
Okay,
complex.
and yeah, that you laid out the landscape very well. There's the kind of regulation part, there's the private sector part, there's also ways that, civil society, just normal citizens can also get involved with this. So going back to the process of offsets, let's say you or I or like a company buys an offset. What exactly is the process for that and the impact that's intended in terms of the offset
Yeah.
purchasing?
So there is 2 types of offsets. There's avoidance offsets and reductions offsets. So avoidance offsets are funding projects that are avoiding the emissions. So for example, deforestation. So if you're paying for something to protect a forest, you're paying for an avoidance because you're avoiding this forest from being deforested. If you're paying for an afforestation, where you're just creating actual woodland, then that is a sequestration credit. And these 2 credits, like when we talk about controversies, are one of the biggest controversial points of carbon credits in general, because the efficacy of either is controversial. The process of it is largely the person who wants to purchase an offset first have to do carbon accounting. So they have to understand their footprint and understand how much they want to offset. Then there are multiple ways of buying offsets. You could just purchase them like literally on a checkbox from your purchase. So like there are a lot of retailers that do that now, where you can offset the transportation of your goods by just clicking a check and adding like 2p to it. But the transparency and understanding of what really happens during those transactions is quite low. Like you don't really actually know what you're buying. It's more kind of like a donation than an offset, in my opinion. But you could go to different types of websites that do specific offsets, and then you can explore the world of offsets. You can think about whether or not you want to buy a nature-based one, which is what Treeconomy does, which is about forests. But there are other types of offsets. So there are wind offsets, like energy type offsets, where you fund like energy projects somewhere else. Anyways, back to the topic of, if you want to buy an offset, how do you buy an offset? You go online, you search carbon offsets, you find a company that is more established, larger firms. There are many in the market. I will not name any because these things can change, but you largely would look for a credit that's been standardized or accredited. So accreditation bodies such as like Vera or Gold Standard, they are people that look at a project and be like, hey, this is a good project. And they are the people that create the credit. So you can buy a credit from these people and you've paid for it. And essentially what that means is that you have offset your emissions. So if I flew and I emitted, I don't know, 0.24 tons, I bought a 0.24 ton of carbon, I'm saying I've paid for my emissions to be essentially negated. And hopefully it means that I have zero impact to the climate. That is the hope, but that is really far from what actually happens.
Yes, it does make sense. And kind of speaking of Treeconomy, you mentioned that Treeconomy is working a lot with the forest sector and really trying to generate that credibility through the monitoring aspects. There's so much we still don't know about nature that even with emission reduction offsets where you are afforesting, it's still really difficult to make it balanced and be like, yes, because you paid this amount, your offsets will be reduced. Could you explain more about the role of technology in this kind of context?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, as you said, there's a lot of players from you paying to the carbon actually being pulled from the ground. And as you said, nature and like the uncertainty of nature is part of this chain that makes the end product maybe not like a one-to-one situation. And how we look at it is before this technology is being created, calculating how much carbon is being sequestered in a forest is very manual. So literally someone has to go to the forest, draw out a piece of, on the map, plot of land, and physically go count the amount of trees that are there, physically go with a tape measure and measure the diameter, breast height for the tree, and then do a lot of calculations for that piece of land and then multiply it by how big the site is. So it's very manual. It's already not very accurate because what if that plot of land then you decided to draw on didn't actually fully represent the forest? And it means that if anything happened between the times that someone goes and measures the tree, no one really knows, right? So that there's a lot of uncertainty with this whole entire process of verifying and quantifying carbon sequestration through forests. It's just that's the resource issue that we have. So how technology helps is we can, not as accurately as a human physically counting a plot of land, but use imagery, like very high quality satellite or drone captured imagery, count the amount of trees actually for throughout the whole entire forest instead of assuming that one plot of land is representative of, the whole entire forest. And we can also obviously do it much more frequently than a human going every single 5 years to monitor like whether or not there's forest fires, whether or not the trees actually look like they're growing at the speed they're supposed to grow. So there was one project that we were monitoring that nothing really big happened to it. It was just not performing the way that was expected. And we could see that because of remote sensing versus if it was a human person going to measure, you wouldn't have known that until like 15 years later for the next verification cycle. So it's much more granular, it's much more frequent. So it means that it makes the whole entire process much more transparent. So it ensures that the dollar that you're paying is actually giving you the performance that you're expected instead of just like, oh, it's in the ether now. I bought something, but I have no way of actually knowing whether or not it makes an impact. So yeah, that's how our technology helps with transparency within this entire value chain, I think.
That's really great. And yeah, it's a very exciting, fast evolving space now, and there is increasingly more and more demand. For example, in the EU, there's a load of new regulations now about disclosures for companies and what they're doing to take action in line with net zero target setting. So, how is that going to affect Treeconomy's work coming up?
Oh, a lot, I think, because now that standards and regulations are coming into the space, more and more people will need the data to actually prove their impact and prove that their investments are making a positive impact. And Treeconomy's technology is a results-based quantitative data. It's not action-based, which is like, oh, you get a point for every dollar you invest. It's about what is happening on the ground and what is the actual carbon being sequestered on the ground. So I think this type of data is very, very crucial going forward. And we're lucky at the moment that carbon, even though it's still uncertain, has a framework to quantify, have a results-based quantification framework and metric versus a lot of other ones such as biodiversity do not have that yet. So we will take what we can. And I think this type of data will going forward be mandatory for a lot of standards and regulations. But yeah, there's still a lot of unknowns and uncertainties that we have to iron out to make sure it's as accurate and as scalable as possible. Because while it is faster and cheaper to do it with like drone data and satellite data, it's still expensive. So if the whole entire globe needs this sort of data, there's still a while to go to make sure it is available for everyone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think what you're really getting at here is that it needs to be a whole package, right? It's not just the technology moving forward, but the frameworks, the policy, the regulation, the private sector interest all needs to come together. And the next step really is to build that robustness and credibility and accessibility of the data even more. And I look forward to seeing how this space will evolve. So thank you so much to Tiffany for sharing all of this. And thank you to Sustainapod listeners for tuning in this week with us. We would love to hear from you about this episode, so let us know your questions and comments by messaging us on Instagram at @sustainapod_GIH or email us at sustainapod@gmail.com. See you next time.